Good afternoon. My name is Edward Sanshin Oberholtzer. I'm the resident priest here at the Joseph Priestley Zen Sangha in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. We're an affiliate of Empty Moon Zen. It's New Year's Eve, and I miss having an actual paper delivered to my house. I miss sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee and holding up in my hands the news of the day. My computer screen doesn't quite cut it. Even if I'm as subscribed to various newspapers as I ever was, they simply don't deliver actual paper here in central Pennsylvania. And this may account for where we sit politically. Now, I have to admit that in leafing through the paper, I was invariably drawn to the comics. And in the absence of rustling paper, I pull up after the news, after the editorials, which I read on the off chance that my high blood pressure medication is too effective. After all of that, but with an air of anticipation, I turn to the comics. These are now saved on a blog reader that allows me to reach them whenever I wish. It's not the same, but there it is. And at this time of year, this turning from one year to the next, there is a particular trope that shows up. The old year greeting the new. An elderly, decrepit, broken down guy with a banner reading 2020 greets the new, young, vibrant kid on the block, wearing the sign of the new year, sometimes over his diaper. I'm looking at you, Arlo and Janice, and you, Canderville and Doonesbury. Now, I suppose that I don't really need this. I have only to look in the mirror to see reality versus expectation. Whereas that young, smooth-faced, red-headed guy that I'm convinced lives behind these two eyes. Who is that old man looking back at me, the one who lurks on Zoom, who stands with my wife, my son, my daughter there in family photographs? Where am I? Dogen, that great 13th century Zen master, the founder of our feast, has us look at a piece of firewood. There in the Genjo Koan, he tells us that that piece of firewood and the ash that we think comes from it become the two things laid out on a timeline. Firewood does not become ash. Ash does not emerge from firewood, yet the firewood contains both its past and its future as ash, and yet is separate from its past and future. That old man in my bathroom mirror does not emerge from the young man I remember. These are the same, past, present, and future. One thing, our very being emerges as time. We ourselves are time. And so here we find time wrapped up in our very being. When I look in that mirror, when you look in that mirror, old man, middle-aged woman, child, corpse, all look back. All are there in that one moment, and time drops away. Dogen tells us that time itself is being, and in the fascicle Yuji, in the Shobogenzo, he points to the identification of being with time. Just as 600 years later, Einstein reimagined space and time as space-time, as one thing, pointing to how time itself bends, stretches, contracts, depending not on the absolute march, the absolute linearity of time, but on the individual circumstances of each of us embedded in that space-time continuum. And time drops away, washed out of the equations that define modern physics. What is left is a relationship of physical qualities. When Galileo, 400 years ago, stood in the nave of the Cathedral of Pisa, and instead of listening to the homily as he should have been, watched the pendulum overhead, swinging, the chandelier swinging back and forth, he noticed that the swings were all identical. Lacking an adequate clock, he measured this by timing the pulse in his wrist. Galileo assumed an absolute time, a timeline unfolding behind all of the events. But of course, all he actually experienced was the swinging of the chandelier and the counting of his own heartbeats. Time really doesn't enter into this at all, except as a fiction. One swing, 5 heartbeats. 5 heartbeats, one swing. Where is time in that? Time stands still, just as time in Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat, when the devil takes the soldier off for violin lessons. A moment spent with the devil turns out to be years he missed with his friends and relatives. Time is relative. It depends on so much: velocity, proximity to mass, but also our perception. Einstein, the father of space-time, at least here in the West, was once quoted as saying, "Put your hand on a hot stove for a minute and it seems like an hour. Sit with a pretty girl for an hour and it seems like a minute." That's relativity. And this, in a more sober form, is just what Dogen found to be the nature of time. And this raises an interesting issue. Just where do science and religion intersect? Could a 13th century Zen priest hit upon the insights of an early 20th century physicist? Stephen Jay Gould wrote of non-overlapping magisteria, making the claim that religion and science answered different questions, had different criteria, that there was no problem with the two since they dwelt in different realms. Dogen and Einstein, Dogen and quantum physics, don't contradict each other since they don't live on the same plane. This was a principle held by the Jesuit priest and astronomer Georges Lemaitre, who first proposed what is now known as the Big Bang, and after publishing this, had to persuade Pope Pius not to see that as confirmation of creation, as the creation found in Genesis. I'm inclined to think, and I'd be the first to say that we should never believe what we think, but I'm inclined to think, nonetheless, that a 13th century Zen, Japanese Zen priest, intelligent and observant, could see our relationship with time, the inseparable nature of our being and time. Sitting there in the quiet darkness of a New Year's Eve in a temple, hearing the bells toll 108 times, time stands still. And in standing still, joins with us, is us. Blake had us find eternity in an hour. It's there in a moment. As Einstein said, if by eternity is meant not endless temporal duration, but timelessness, then he lives eternally who lives in the present. And living in this very moment, eternally, we are the firewood, the seedling, and the ash. Thank you, and Happy New Year.